Shortly after midnight, on the 6th of June, 1944, a German ground observer named Obergefreiter Thiel picked up a field telephone at his post near the Cotentin Peninsula and delivered one of the most understated battlefield reports in the entire war. Loud airplane noise. "The enemy is attacking." Thiel had no idea what was already in the air above him. 801 American C-47 transport aircraft, strung out over 70 miles of English Channel sky, were crossing the French coastline at that moment. Inside each one, paratroopers stood in the red glow of jump lights, hooked to the static line, wearing 130 pounds of equipment, strapped, sewn, and taped to their bodies. Some of them had pinned a playing card to their helmets. Some had shaved their heads into mohawks to unsettle whoever saw them first. A few had written their blood type on the back of their hands in ink that wouldn't wash off in the rain. 13,100 of them were about to fall out of those aircraft into the dark over German-occupied France. Here is what the German command genuinely believed about these men at that moment: that American Airborne was essentially broken, that the Sicily drop the previous summer had proven it, that scattered, disorganized paratroopers landing across 60 miles of countryside in the wrong places without their equipment, which is exactly what happened in Sicily, were a nuisance rather than a threat. German officers who had studied the Sicily drop concluded that if Americans tried this again, the same chaos would unfold. And that chaos, they believed, was something they could handle. They were right about the chaos. They were catastrophically wrong about everything else. To understand what happened on the night of June 5th, going into June 6th, you have to understand what the Germans actually did to prepare, because it was extensive. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, had ordered over 1 million wooden poles driven into the fields of Normandy. 4 to 5 meters tall, wired together with mines and booby traps at the tips, christened Rommelspargel, Rommel's asparagus, by the troops who planted them. The idea was straightforward. Any glider coming in at night would hit the poles and disintegrate. Any paratrooper landing between them would be caught by tripwires. Rommel had also ordered the lowlands along the Merdere and Duve rivers deliberately flooded. What looked on a German map like a firm green valley was, by June 1944, a swamp. Some of those flooded areas were only 1 meter deep, shallow enough to wade through with effort, but a man wearing 130 pounds of gear, falling out of the sky in the dark, had no way to know that before he hit the water. Beyond the physical defenses, Rommel had moved the 91st Luftlande Infantry Division specifically to the Cotentin Peninsula in May 1944. The 91st existed for one purpose: to counterattack airborne landings. He also positioned Major Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte's 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment as a rapid reaction force, because veteran paratroopers were considered the men most likely to anticipate how an airborne enemy would think and move. None of this failed because of poor planning. It failed because of something nobody planned for. Before we get to what happened that night, we need to talk about a man who never made it to France. Major General William Carey Lee was born in Dunn, North Carolina, in 1895. He was a quiet, methodical officer who had spent the better part of a decade trying to convince the United States Army that it needed soldiers who could fight from the sky. He had traveled to Europe in the late 1930s to watch Hitler's paratroopers train, returned to Washington, and written a proposal for an American airborne force that was initially ignored, then questioned, then, reluctantly, approved. On the 25th of June, 1940, Lee was given 2 officers and 48 enlisted men to form what the Army called the Parachute Test Platoon at Fort Benning, Georgia. That was the entire American airborne program at its founding 2 officers and 48 men. By 1942, Lee commanded the newly activated 101st Airborne Division. He told his men in their first formal order, "The 101st has no history, but it has a rendezvous with destiny." He meant it as inspiration. He had no way of knowing how precisely right he was. On the 5th of February 1944, 4 months before D-Day, Lee was at his desk at division headquarters in England when he told his executive officer, "Bud, I can't go any farther. I have a terrible pain in my chest." A heart attack. A second one followed in March. He was evacuated to the United States and would never return to combat command. On D-Day, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne jumped over Normandy shouting, "Bill Lee," at 700 feet. Lee listened by radio from his house in Dunn, North Carolina. He died in 1948 at 53 years old. The man who replaced Lee was Major General Maxwell Davenport Taylor, 42 years old, born in Keytesville, Missouri, West Point class of 1922. Taylor spoke French, Spanish, and Japanese. In September 1943, he had secretly parachuted into Rome in civilian clothes to negotiate with the Italian government, behind German lines, alone. The Italians eventually backed out of their end of the arrangement, and Taylor had to be extracted before the Germans found him. He considered this one of the more embarrassing episodes of his career. Taylor took command of the 101st in March 1944. One of his first decisions was practical and slightly unusual. He ordered 7,000 small metal clickers, the kind sold in dime stores as children's toys, from a manufacturer in Birmingham, England. The idea came directly from Sicily, where paratroopers had scattered so badly that Americans were shooting Americans in the dark. The clicking system was straightforward. 1 click meant, "Who's there?" and 2 clicks back meant, "Friend." Taylor had his supply officer stencil the instructions on each box in 2 languages, English and a phonetic French explanation, in case a French civilian found one and panicked. The 101st paratroopers carried crickets. The 82nd Airborne, jumping the same night, used a voice challenge, "Flash," answered with "Thunder." Both systems worked about as well as you'd expect when 13,000 men are scattered across 40 kilometers of countryside at 2 in the morning. Commanding the 82nd Airborne Division was Major General Matthew Bunker Ridgway, 49 years old, West Point class of 1917. His men called him Tin Tits, a term of affection, because of the 2 hand grenades he kept strapped visibly to his chest at all times. Nobody ever asked him why he wore them there instead of on his belt. The answer seemed obvious enough. Ridgway had fought for the airborne program alongside Lee and had a specific, documented view of what would happen if the drops failed. He told Eisenhower's staff that even heavy airborne casualties were acceptable given the mission's importance to the beach landings. Ridgway jumped with his men on D-Day. He was 49 years old, and he jumped out of an airplane in the dark over occupied France. His assistant division commander was Brigadier General James Maurice Gavin, 37 years old. Gavin had been born in Brooklyn to an Irish immigrant mother, placed in an orphanage as a child, raised by foster parents in the Pennsylvania coal country. He enlisted as a teenager, talked his way into West Point, graduated in 1929, and spent the next decade reading everything he could find about warfare. Rommel's infantry tactics, Sun Tzu, T. E. Lawrence, and the German Army's own doctrinal papers. He carried an M1 Garand rifle in combat because he had concluded that an officer who didn't carry a rifle was advertising his own location to enemy snipers. Before the jump, Gavin told his men, "This will be the most glorious or most spectacular episode in our history, or it will be another Little Big Horn." He said it to them straight, without any theater. It was the most honest pre-battle speech any commander gave that night. At 8:30 on the evening of June 5th, Eisenhower drove to RAF Greenham Common to visit the 101st Airborne before they boarded. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He walked among the paratroopers while they blacked up their faces, checked their equipment, and wrote letters they asked someone to send if they didn't come back. He stopped next to Lieutenant Wallace Strobel of E Company, 502nd PIR, a 22-year-old from Michigan who was serving as jump master for his stick. Eisenhower asked where he was from, and Strobel said Michigan. Eisenhower's face changed. He talked for a moment about fishing in Michigan and described his fly casting technique with enough enthusiasm that Strobel, who would later recount this conversation in a 1994 interview, remembered thinking the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe was trying to calm himself down more than anyone else. The famous photograph taken that evening, Eisenhower speaking intently and pointing at Strobel while surrounded by paratroopers, captures a moment that looks like a solemn final charge. What was actually happening was a man talking about fishing. After the last overloaded C-47 roared down the runway and lifted into the dark, Eisenhower's driver, K. Summersby, saw tears on his face. "Well," he said quietly, "it's on." He had, earlier that day, written a short note in case the landings failed. He misdated it July 5th. It read, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He underlined "mine alone" with a long, hard stroke. He crumpled the note and put it in his pocket when the invasion succeeded. His aide retrieved it from a trash can. It is preserved at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. The man who had told Eisenhower the whole operation was going to be a catastrophe was Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. On May 29th and 30th of 1944, Leigh-Mallory formally urged Eisenhower to cancel the American airborne drop. His written assessment predicted at least 50% casualties among paratroopers and 70% among glider troops. He called the operation, in Eisenhower's later description, a prediction of futile slaughter of 2 fine airborne divisions. Eisenhower read this, spent what he later described as a soul-racking period of consideration, and overruled it. His reply to Leigh-Mallory was delivered by hand. "A strong airborne attack is essential to the whole operation, and it must go on." Leigh-Mallory was the first person to call Eisenhower on D-Day with congratulations. He apologized for adding to the worry. By the numbers, his prediction was off by a factor of between 6 and 9. Actual casualties among the paratroopers on the night jump ran at roughly 8%, not 50, not 70. Leigh-Mallory died in November 1944, when his transport aircraft crashed in the French Alps en route to his new command in Southeast Asia. The Germans, meanwhile, were at dinner. This is not a rhetorical device. It is the precise recorded situation of multiple senior German commanders at the moment the American paratroopers were boarding their aircraft in England. General Oberst Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the German 7th Army, had organized a Kriegsspiel, a tabletop war game, to be held in Rennes, Brittany, beginning on the morning of June 6th. The scenario being gamed was an Allied landing in Normandy. On the evening of June 5th, Dollmann's division commanders were either already in Rennes or traveling toward it through the Norman night. This included General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben of the 709th Infantry Division and General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falley of the 91st Luftlande Division, the very division Rommel had positioned to destroy an airborne attack. Field Marshal Rommel himself was in Germany, at his home in Herrlingen, celebrating his wife Lucy's birthday. He had given her a pair of shoes from Paris. Adolf Hitler was asleep at the Berghof in Berchtesgaden. His staff would not wake him until mid-morning, as it was considered too dangerous to disturb him when something might turn out to be a feint. At roughly 12:07 a.m., on June 6th, Obergefreiter Thiel made his phone call. By 1:11 a.m., the 716th Infantry Division had warned General Erich Marx at LXXXIV Corps headquarters in St. Lo that paratroopers were landing in the Cotentin. By 1:20 a.m., the German 7th Army had its notification. By 1:30 a.m., Dahlmann ordered a general alert. At 1:45 a.m., Marx had additional reports of Americans between Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and Sainte-Mere-Eglise. None of this information was wrong. It was also almost completely useless, because the reports contradicted each other, and there was no way to tell which ones described the main effort. Paratroopers were reported east of Sainte-Mere-Eglise. Paratroopers were reported west of Carentan. Paratroopers were reported near Bayeux, which is 40 kilometers from where any American actually landed. And by 7 a.m., Marx received a report that there had been no airborne drop south of Carentan at all, which was false, but by then he had no reconnaissance aircraft available to check. Marx had lost his left leg on the Eastern Front in 1941. He was, by most accounts, one of the few German generals in Normandy who had seriously gamed the scenario of an Allied landing here. June 6th was his 53rd birthday. At some point that morning, looking at the maps and reports flooding his headquarters, he said to the commander of the 21st Panzer Division, "If you don't succeed in throwing them into the sea, we shall have lost the war." Marx was killed 6 days later by an Allied fighter bomber. A 20mm cannon shell severed his femoral artery on a road outside St. Lo. Meanwhile, on a road outside the village of Picoville, something was happening that would become one of the stranger biographical footnotes of the entire D-Day operation. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falley had left his headquarters at Château de Berneville to drive to the Rennes War Games on the evening of June 5th. Then, somewhere on the dark Norman road, he heard aircraft engines overhead, multiple aircraft. He turned his staff car around and drove back toward his headquarters at high speed. His car approached the chateau and was challenged to stop by a group of American paratroopers from Headquarters Company, 3rd Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. These men had landed nowhere near their intended drop zone and had no idea whose headquarters they were near. When the car didn't stop and the driver, Major Joachim Bartuzat, accelerated instead, the Americans opened fire. Falley, wounded, got out of the car and moved toward a barn doorway. First Lieutenant Malcolm D. Brannan fired again and killed him. Wilhelm Falley was the first German general killed on D-Day. He never gave a single order to the division that existed specifically to stop what was happening to him. When Brannan reported the kill to Ridgway, he was reportedly smiling. Ridgway's reply was characteristically dry. "Well, in our present situation, killing division commanders does not strike me as being particularly hilarious, but I congratulate you. I'm glad it was a German division commander you got." The 91st Luftlande Division entered its first combat on D-Day without its commander. His body wasn't discovered by his own men until June 8th. There was a third layer of confusion added to the German night, and this one was entirely engineered. Operation Titanic was a British deception plan that dropped approximately 400 burlap dummies across areas south of the real drop zones. The dummies were fitted with small explosive devices that simulated rifle fire when they hit the ground. 4-man SAS teams accompanied them, equipped with loudspeakers and recordings of combat noise to generate the impression of paratroopers assembling and fighting. General Marks, needing to respond to the most alarming reports first, dispatched his primary reserve, the 915th Grenadier Regiment south toward Carentan, to deal with what appeared to be a major landing. That column navigated narrow Norman country roads all night, was still moving at 6 a.m. when the invasion fleet appeared on the horizon and then had to turn entirely around. The regiment arrived at the beaches late, disorganized, and after the moment when it might have made a difference. 13,000 paratroopers and 400 dummies had effectively removed an entire German infantry regiment from the critical morning window. The drop itself was, by every standard measure, an operational disaster. Of the 18 American Pathfinder teams that jumped early to mark the drop zones with electronic beacons and lights, only one, the team assigned to Drop Zone O for the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, landed accurately and successfully set up both their Eureka transponder beacon and their marker lights. The rest were scattered by a solid cloud bank at 1,500 feet over the western Cotentin. Pilots who had never been under fire took evasive action when German anti-aircraft batteries opened up on their formations, climbing, diving, and accelerating past the safe jump speed. At high speed, the men inside were thrown off their feet, crashed against the sides of the aircraft, and then fell out into the dark at the wrong altitude over the wrong ground. 60% of the aircraft in the drop carried no trained navigators. After 24 hours, only 2,500 of the 101st Airborne's roughly 6,600 paratroopers were under any form of divisional control. For the 82nd, 4,000 men were unaccounted for by mid-morning, along with 60% of their heavy equipment. Some men drowned in the flooded marshes Rommel had built, falling into water that looked like fields in the dark while wearing 130 pounds of gear. Estimates of how many men drowned in the Murderette Swamp alone range from 36 confirmed recoveries to perhaps 100. The water in some places was only waist deep, but that wasn't enough. The scattered drops should have been catastrophic. What they actually became is harder to categorize. German reports arriving at 7th Army headquarters described paratroopers everywhere, south of Carentan, west of Saint-Lô, north of Isigny, east of Sainte-Mere-Eglise, west of the Merderet. The reports were simultaneously correct because there were Americans scattered across hundreds of square kilometers and impossible to turn into coherent tactical information. Where were the headquarters? Where were the reserves forming? The answer was that there were no reserves forming and no headquarters operating. There were groups of 5, 8, 15 American paratroopers assembling in the dark around the first senior man who could be found, using a clicking toy or a whispered password to tell friend from enemy, and then moving toward whatever objective seemed reachable. This was exactly what their training had prepared them for. American airborne doctrine, developed from hard study of failures in Sicily, expected the drops to scatter. It expected individual soldiers to operate without orders, without radio contact, without any form of organized support, and still achieve their objectives. The Army had spent 4 years teaching men how to fight alone and confused in the dark. The Germans were looking for headquarters to attack and formations to engage. What they found instead was 100 separate small unit actions happening simultaneously across terrain they thought they controlled. Near the village of Sainte-Mere-Eglise, Private John Marvin Steele of F Company, 505th PIR, had a problem that was entirely distinct from what most of his fellow paratroopers were dealing with. An incendiary had set fire to a building on the edge of the town square a short time before his aircraft reached the drop zone. The fire lit the entire square. French civilians were forming a bucket brigade under German supervision. The church bells were ringing the alarm. Then, 2 plane loads of Americans fell into the illuminated square from directly overhead. Some of them were shot before they reached the ground. Some landed in the fire. Steele's parachute caught on a pinnacle of the church tower. He hung there, wounded in the foot, 12 feet from the church belfry, while the battle for the square played out below him for approximately 2 hours. He played dead, hanging motionless while German soldiers looked up at him from the square. 2 German soldiers eventually cut him down and took him prisoner. He escaped approximately 4 hours later when American forces arrived. By 4 a.m., Major Edward Krause's 3rd Battalion, 505th PIR, had taken the town, with 30 Germans captured and 11 killed. Sainte-Mere-Eglise was the first French town liberated on D-Day. A mannequin with a parachute has hung from the church steeple ever since. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Hayes Vandervoort was 27 years old. He had been promoted to command the 2nd Battalion, 505th PIR, 5 days before D-Day. He landed in an apple orchard outside Sainte-Mere-Eglise, heard something snap in his left ankle on impact, and without saying anything to the men assembling around him, quietly asked his battalion surgeon, Captain Lyle Putnam, to examine the ankle with as little demonstration as possible. Putnam confirmed it was broken. Vandervoort had Putnam bind it as tightly as possible, replaced his jump boot over the bound ankle, laced it hard, and stood up. He used his M1 Garand rifle as a crutch for the first hours of June 6th, later receiving actual crutches from a French resident. He organized scattered paratroopers throughout the night, directed the defense of Sainte-Mere-Eglise against German counterattacks, and moved constantly under fire while doing it. The U.S. Army Center for Military Leadership later selected Vandervoort as the outstanding ground battle commander of the entire Second World War. In The Longest Day, John Wayne played him at 55. Wayne was nearly twice Vandervoort's actual age when he fought on D-Day. South of Sainte-Mere-Eglise, General Gavin was making his way toward La Fière Bridge with about 75 men, a fraction of the 82nd Airborne, assembled from whoever he'd found in the dark. The bridge crossed the Murderette River at a point where Rommel's engineers had flooded the surrounding marshland to a width of nearly a kilometer. The causeway on the western side of the bridge was approximately 500 yards of elevated road over open swamp, with no cover in any direction. The German positions on the other side were prepared, dug in, and holding. The fighting at La Fière lasted 4 days, from June 6th through 9th. American paratroopers held the bridge side. Germans held the causeway. Neither side could dislodge the other without crossing that 500-yard stretch of open road. On June 9th, Gavin personally led the assault across the causeway with the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment. Military historian S.L.A. Marshall, who interviewed the survivors afterward, called what happened on that causeway probably the bloodiest small unit struggle in the experience of American arms. Both Ridgway and Gavin were seen on the causeway under fire, moving forward. More than 250 Americans died in the 4-day battle for a stone bridge over a flooded Norman stream. 6 miles to the south, 1st Lieutenant Richard Davis Winters of E Company, 506th PIR, 101st Airborne, had assembled 12 men at the edge of a hedgerow overlooking a field called Brecourt Manor on the morning of June 6th. Winters was 26 years old, born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He had grown up Mennonite and retained from that upbringing a quality of calm that his men found either reassuring or unnerving depending on the situation. He had lost his weapon during the jump, torn from its mounting by the shock of the parachute opening, and was carrying a rifle borrowed from a dead German soldier. What Winters could hear from that hedgerow, and what he understood from a quick reconnaissance, was that 4 German 105 mm howitzers from the 6th Battery, Artillery Regiment 191, were positioned along a trench network in the field ahead. Those guns were firing directly down the exit causeways at Utah Beach, where the 4th Infantry Division was coming ashore. The guns had to be destroyed. 12 men against 50 to 60 defenders with 4 artillery pieces and multiple MG-42 positions. Winters had no way to get more men, no way to call artillery, and no time to wait. He attacked, moving gun by gun through the German trench system, using smoke grenades and fire and movement in a way the Army now teaches at West Point as a textbook case. Winters' initial assault force, reinforced to about 23 as more paratroopers found them, destroyed all 4 guns using TNT placed down the barrels. They killed approximately 15 German defenders and captured 12 more. They lost 4 men killed and several wounded. They also found something Winters had not expected, a German map showing every artillery position and machine gun emplacement in the area. The map went up the chain of command immediately. Winters was recommended for the Medal of Honor. He received the Distinguished Service Cross instead, as Army policy at the time limited 1 Medal of Honor per division per action, and another man from the 101st had already been nominated for the same battle. The mission of the entire 101st Airborne Division on D-Day. The reason all 6,600 of those men jumped was 4 exits. The Utah Beach landing area was separated from the interior of the Cotentin Peninsula by flooded marshland. The 4th Infantry Division, 21,000 men, was going to land on that beach at dawn. If the exits from the beach were held by German defenders, if the causeways were blocked, mined, and defended, 21,000 men would be trapped against the channel with nowhere to go. The entire Utah landing depended on those exits being open. Lieutenant Colonel Julian Ewell, with approximately 60 men of the 501st PIR, cleared Exit 1 by approximately 9 a.m. The 502nd PIR secured Exits 3 and 4. Utah Beach, on June 6th, suffered 197 casualties. Omaha Beach, where there was no airborne support on the flanks, suffered somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000. Robert Cole was 29 years old, born at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, West Point class of 1,939. His father had been a soldier. Cole had grown up on Army posts and understood from childhood that soldiers are the people who walk toward the thing that everyone else runs from. By June 11th, 5 days after D-Day, Cole's battalion of 265 men was working to capture Carentan, the town that connected Utah and Omaha beaches. The 2 American beachheads were still separate, and Carentan was the hinge. Cole's men were moving along a narrow causeway toward the town when German fire pinned them down completely. They lay in the ditch for over an hour. Artillery requests went unanswered. The men couldn't advance and couldn't retreat without exposing themselves. Cole threw smoke grenades to cover the advance, blew his whistle, stood up with his pistol drawn, and ordered a bayonet charge. Initially, only Cole and a small group followed. Then the rest of the battalion saw their commander on his feet, moving forward, and they followed. The charge cost 130 casualties out of 265 men, a 50% loss rate. It broke the German position blocking Carentan. The town fell on June 12th. Cole received the Medal of Honor posthumously. On the 18th of September 1944, during Operation Market Garden, a German sniper shot him through the head while he was placing orange identification panels for friendly aircraft near Best, Netherlands. He never knew he'd been nominated. By the end of the first day, the numbers tell a story. The German command in Normandy was struggling to read. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, 13,100 American paratroopers had landed, a number that by itself exceeded the entire strength of many German divisions. They had lost 2,499 men killed, wounded, and missing on D-Day alone. 338 dead, 904 wounded, 1,257 initially unaccounted for. In the 82nd Airborne, 15 of 16 battalion commanders in the infantry regiments were killed or wounded. But against those American losses, the German 7th Army had lost its most important commodity: time and the ability to make decisions. A division commander was dead before he gave an order. Reserve forces had spent the night chasing dummy paratroopers south toward Carentan. The 21st Panzer Division, Rommel's mobile counterattack force, the one thing that might have driven the beach landings back into the sea, had waited 9 hours for authorization to move, because the command structure required Hitler's personal approval to commit panzer reserves, and Hitler was asleep. When the panzers finally moved at midday, they were attacking through territory already thick with American paratroopers who had been moving through it since 1 a.m. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's official report, written 2 weeks later, claimed the airborne drops had been fully expected and that the landings had been defeated in most places. This report is, in the measured assessment of military historians who have read the German 7th Army's own war diary, essentially a cover letter for a catastrophe. The lesson Germany drew from Sicily, that American airborne was a disorganized force, incapable of decisive action, was correct about the symptom and completely wrong about the conclusion. Yes, the American drops scattered. They scattered in Sicily, and they scattered in Normandy. The 101st Airborne's first-day drop covered an area 40 kilometers by 25 kilometers, a dispersion zone more than 6 times what any plan envisioned. Men landed in the wrong fields, in the wrong towns, in the wrong marshes. They lost their equipment. They lost their radios. They lost each other. And then they clicked twice with a small metal toy, or whispered flash into the dark, and waited for thunder. Found a man next to them with a rifle, and went to work. This is what the German officer corps, studying the Sicily maps, had failed to understand. The dispersion wasn't a failure of the American concept, it was the concept. An army that trains its soldiers to act without orders, to evaluate a situation and respond to it without waiting for instructions, doesn't break when it scatters. It generates confusion for the defender in direct proportion to how widely it scatters. Every German report about paratroopers in 6 different places at once was accurate. What those reports couldn't convey was that the men filing them were looking at independent teams of Americans operating exactly as trained, without a network above them, and therefore without a network to destroy. General Gavin put it plainly after the war. He had read the German after-action assessments and found them focused on where the Americans had landed, not on what they had done when they got there. The Germans had counted the bodies in the wrong fields and concluded that airborne was broken. What they should have looked at was the causeways, and the guns at Brecourt Manor, and a German division commander lying dead outside his own headquarters, and the fact that 21,000 men came off Utah Beach by noon on June 6th because 4 exits had been cleared by scattered men with cricket clickers and borrowed rifles. By June 30th, 1944, the combined 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had taken a total of over 9,000 casualties, approximately 46% of the 82nd's entire strength. These were not units that had fought lightly. The German formations opposing them, particularly the 91st Luftlande Division and the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, were quality troops who fought hard. But the German casualties attributed to the American airborne campaign through the end of the Normandy fighting totaled approximately 21,300 killed, wounded, and captured more than twice the Americans who fell. And the 91st Luftlande Division, the unit Rommel had placed in the Cotentin specifically to destroy an airborne landing, entered its first action of the war without its commanding general, spent the first 4 days of the invasion reacting to 100 different engagements simultaneously, and never once controlled the ground it had been assigned to hold. Maxwell Taylor spent D-Day commanding a division he could barely find, scraping together groups of men from whatever hedgerow they'd landed in, doing with 75 or 100 what he'd planned to do with 6,000. He later wrote that the lesson of D-Day was that the quality of training had been more important than any plan, because no plan survived contact with the Cotentin in the dark. Matthew Ridgway fought without relief for 33 consecutive days after D-Day, from Sainte-Mere-Eglise to Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, without a single piece of ground taken being given back. He survived the war, commanded United Nations forces in Korea in 1950, and served as Army Chief of Staff. He died in 1993 at 98 years old. James Gavin made 4 combat jumps before the war ended: Sicily, Italy, Normandy, Holland, and no other American general made more than 1. He was 37 when he commanded the 82nd as its youngest divisional commander. He died in 1990 at 82. Dick Winters spent the rest of the war fighting across Europe, from Normandy to Hitler's Eagle's Nest at Berchtesgaden. He was quiet about his own service for most of his life, living on a farm in Pennsylvania and refusing nearly all interviews. He made one exception in his final years when he said, "I cherish the memories of a question my grandson asked me the other day when he said, 'Grandpa, were you a hero in the war?' Grandpa said, 'No, but I served in a company of heroes.'" He died in January 2011 at 92, at home in Hershey, Pennsylvania. At the church in Sainte-Mere-Eglise, the mannequin hangs from the steeple in all weather. The locals replace it periodically when the wind and rain wear it out. Every June 6th, veterans came back for decades, fewer each year, to stand in the square where men fell from the sky in firelight. The last of them are almost all gone now. In a field outside Picaville, there is no marker for where Wilhelm Falley's staff car hit the wall. In the National Archives, there is a note written by Dwight Eisenhower, misdated July 5, 1944, with one phrase underlined twice mine alone. The American airborne program that William Lee built from 50 men in the summer of 1940 had, by the time the war ended, grown to 5 full divisions: the 82nd, the 101st, the 11th, the 13th, and the 17th, each around 10,000 men, each capable of landing anywhere in the world with no road, no port, and no runway. The German Fallschirmjäger, after Crete, never made another major combat jump for the rest of the war. This is what happens when one military studies failure and learns from it, and another studies the same failure and draws the wrong lesson.